Oh, I can start? Okay, well, let's go. Well, today we're going to talk about Latin American countries' foreign policies. Uh, the approach will be a historical approach from the beginning of the independence life of our countries in the region up to date. So from the historical point of view, we can say that there were different um, periods of our independence life, and as a consequence of that, the independence foreign policies that we were implementing. Uh, First of all, or I mean, the first period can be the period that begins in the second part of the 19th century to the first part of the 20th century. During this period, Latin American countries implemented what we can call a European-centered foreign policy, and it have to be very simplistic on my point of view. I would say that two were the main partners: Great Britain regarding trade and economics, and France regarding culture. Of course, there were exceptions to this general regional trend. We can, for example, consider what happened in Paraguay since 1810 to 1870, where Paraguayan foreign policy was not so centered on only Great Britain and France. Of course, they were, but they were not so focused on being part of the British economic system. And of course, another example can be Argentina from 1830 to 1850, where we even fought a war with Great Britain and France in order to avoid their product to enter into our markets. So during this period, it was quite clear that Great Britain was the most important power to any Latin American culture regarding trade, uh, were British companies in charge of the most important part of the economies of our Latin American countries, and our economies were pretty focused only on exporting primary goods to Great Britain. Regarding culture, of course, we need to bear in mind that France, as the most enlightenment country at the beginning of the 19th century, of course, was considered as the most developed country in the world, and many Latin American politicians were focused on France when they're considering what would be the future of our culture. I can give you a good example. Juan Bautista Alberdi, a very important thinker of Argentina in the 19th century, he even proposed that we Latin Americans must stop speaking Spanish and to begin speaking French, because French was most suitable as a language of culture and scientific innovations. So as you can see, the idea behind this kind of a statement was that the Hispanic past was bad and was something that we must reject. And if we want to develop, we must become Europeans. And the most European country, of course, was France regarding culture. Right? The most European country in terms of development was Great Britain. So it is easily to understand how our decision makers were quite focused on those two European countries during the majority of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. As you can imagine, also that the influence of the United States in the region was opposed by the Latin American countries. Latin American countries didn't want to accept the importance or the growing importance of the United States in the region. An example I can give to you, it was the first Pan American meeting in Washington in 1889, where the majority of the Latin American countries opposed to the entering of the United States into Latin American politics. So if you take a look at those moments at the end of the 19th century, many Latin American countries were considering that it was a bright future based on the trade on commodities. That would be just in a very simplistic way to say what many decision makers in the region were thinking about. Of course, this general framework suffered after two important milestones. The first one was, of course, the First World War, and the second one was the financial crisis of 1929. Because those two milestones generated new challenges, new realities, and of course, what became clear and clear in our region is that United States was emerging as a growing regional power, and it was not so easy to say no to what the Americans wanted to do in the region, a region that they consider the American backyard, especially after 1998, when the United States defeated Spain in the war in Cuba and Puerto Rico. So also another consequence of that moment was that European states became more focused on what we can call nationalistic driving economic policies. Yeah. So European states, as a result of the crisis, began to try to trade with their own colonies and not with Latin American states that were not part of those colonies. For example, we can take into consideration the very famous decision taken in 1932 by Great Britain in order to promote the trade with New Zealand, Australia, and Canada instead of Argentina. That generated a huge response from the Argentinian side. Even the vice president went to this famous Ottawa meeting. He said there with a very famous, in a very famous discourse, we are very proud to be an informal part of the British Empire. So what we were saying at this moment is we really need those markets. We really need to sell our products, and we are ready to do whatever it is you can tell us what we should do in order to not to lose those important markets. So that was the situation in the 20s and the 30s of the 20th century, where Latin American countries were trying to maintain this special relationship they had with the European powers, but at the same time, the situation was changing because European powers during this interwar period were much more focused on European politics and the future of European continent than in including Latin American economies into their system. But at the same time, as I told you a couple of minutes ago, the United States was increasingly interested on what's going on in Latin America. So if I have to say, the Latin American countries were losing a partner, and there was another partner who was very interested in doing business and being very active in our region. Another important period of our history was the period that began after the Second World War. So we can call it, according to international political analysis, the Cold War. What is the most important and interesting point of view is almost all Latin American countries after the Second World War implemented Washington-centered foreign policies. It was quite clear for Latin American countries that Washington was there, Washington was a big power, Washington was a global player, and of course Latin America must be with the United States. Well, I can give you a couple of examples. The most important is what we call the Rio Treaty, which is the Inter-American Defense Treaty that was, of course, was supported, was promoted by the United States, but the main consequence of that was that the Latin American countries were supposed to be allies of the United States if a foreign country, I mean, a non-American country, referring to Americas, North America, Central America, and South America, attack our continent. So as you can imagine, what we're talking about is a potential Soviet attack. And if there was a potential Soviet attack, all the American countries, or every American country was supposed to work with the United States in order to defend our continent. And this is why, of course, during this period, there were several exceptions. I would say that the most famous exception of this foreign policy was Cuba, since Fidel Castro took power in 1959. The foreign policy of Cuba was not focused on the United States. Of course, maybe certain periods in a specific moments, for example, Chile during the 70s with Allende government, or Argentina during the Peronist government from 1946 to 1955. So there were exceptions, but the general trend was to establish United States as the priority of our foreign policies. As you can see, foreign policy agenda was focused mainly on security issues. Everything that was about foreign policy was based on security issues. There were not any issues at development, or maybe just for a couple of years during Kennedy's government in the United States, but the most important issue were security-related issues. The end of the Cold War and the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s of the 20th century generated a new period of our foreign policy. There was two issues that were complementary to what I'm going to refer as this new period. The first issue we must bear in mind is, of course, the end of the Cold War. Yeah, the Soviet Union was not there anymore. The communist threat was not there anymore, and of course, the countries were not only focused as being pro-American or being pro-Russian or pro-Soviet state. Actually, just to be honest, during the 60s and the 70s, many Latin American countries began in a very, let's say, diplomatic way to try to escape from this Washington influence through what is known as the non-aligned movement. But if you take a look at the entrance of different Latin American states into this movement, you will see that it was very much driven by domestic politics of the Latin American countries. What I mean, when a government that was not so pro-American was taking power, this specific country could enter into the non-aligned movement. When a government that was most favorable to the United States, this country would go out from the non-aligned movement. For example, an example I can give you again, of course, is Argentina, where we entered in 1973 to the non-aligned movement, and in 1989, if I'm not mistaken, we abandoned this movement because the new government that was in Argentina was much more focused and much more United States centered. So, but again, the trend it remained the same. During the Cold War, majority of the Latin American countries were what we can say Washington-oriented, implementing foreign policies. And after the Cold War, some things began to change. The end of the Cold War and at the same time the strengthening of the democracies in the region generated a new environment at the, let's say, in the first part of the 90s of the 20th century. This new environment allowed to the Latin American state to have the possibility to frame new foreign policies that were less dependent on the United States and this Cold War framework. Of course, again, this is a general trend. We can establish many exceptions or a couple of exceptions, but I can say that many Latin American countries began after the Cold War to think about how to enter into world politics by not following anymore this Cold War framework. So we can say that during the last part of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century, there are many Latin American foreign policies. For the first time in our history, we began to develop, or each country began to develop its own approach to international affairs. In this new chapter of our history, we can establish a different group of countries in order to make this analysis a bit more easy. For example, I can say that just after what is called the unipolar moment, I mean the first year of the 90s in the 20th century, when United States was quite active in the region, the end of the interest of the United States in the region was after 9/11. After 9/11, the United States lose its interest on the Latin American region because other geopolitical regions became much more important. So this is another new trend. For the first time in more than 100 years, the United States was not so interested anymore on what's going on in Latin America. So if we have to organize those years and the Latin American countries, we can say that we can identify three main groups. The first group is that what we can say it is the countries that develop a preferential relation with the United States. Of course, the Cold War was not there anymore, but many countries choose to continue a preferential relation with the United States. As an example, I can give you, for example, Mexico. Since the establishment of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, in 1994, foreign policy of Mexico, economy of Mexico continue and to be very focused on the United States. Another example, for example, was Argentina in the 90s, where the Argentinian government was so established the United States as a priority. And I can give you two examples of our Argentinian foreign policy during those years. The first example is that Argentina participated in the Gulf War in 1991. And of course, as a consequence of that and the collaboration of the Argentinian government in 1994, we've been granted the status of extra NATO allied. So imagine South American countries that was part of the Gulf War and then get this appointment as extra NATO ally. Another example we can give is Colombia, where with the support of the United States, Colombians were allowed to fight the narco-terrorism in the famous Plan Colombia. So this group of states, as you can see, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, during different parts of the 90s and the first part of the 21st century, they still consider that it was quite important to develop these preferential relations with the United States. A second group of countries that we can identify is those countries that generated what we can call an anti-imperialist foreign policy. And when I mean anti-imperialist foreign policy, I'm mainly saying anti-American foreign policy. Of course, those countries were led by Venezuela, during Hugo Chavez years, the president of the Republic of Venezuela, and other countries that were included on what is known as ALBA countries. I mean, those Bolivarian countries, pretty close to of course, to Venezuela, with a strong anti-Americanism rhetoric, and of course, with other elements of what is called the New Left movement in the region. But other example of that can be President Evo Morales in Bolivia, President Correa in Ecuador, and President Ortega in Nicaragua. Those countries were not only were opposing to the United States, but also they were taking other new steps. And among those steps, we can, for example, say that they were quite eager to establish relations with a state that were not so or were considered a kind of enemies, foes of the United States. It's a very clear example, those preferential relations that Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, and even Nicaragua established with the Islamic Republic of Iran at the time where the Islamic Republic of Iran was being isolated by the United Nations Security Council after the establishment of the economic pressure that this institution established after 2006. So this was the second group of Latin American countries, what we can call these ALBA or countries. And of course, it is interesting to know that Venezuela was the main driving force behind this movement. And of course, it is important to note as well that Venezuela could do this because of the high prices, the high level of the prices of oil during the first year of the 21st century, reaching the peak in 2008 and 2009. So the Venezuela foreign policy was able to convince other countries, as I'm saying, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and of course, the great backer of Venezuela was Cuba during those years, because Venezuela has the resources that allowed its government to generate this very active foreign policy. There is then a third kind of, or third group of countries during the region and during those years that we can frame as multi-vectorial foreign policy countries, a concept that is quite familiar to the Kazakhstan foreign policy. And we can say that the countries that were implemented this multi-vectorial foreign policy were, for example, Chile, a country that signed free trade agreement with countries and commercial blocs in order to increase the international contacts and international possibilities for its products. And Chile was quite famous during those years because Chile wanted to sign as many as possible of those free trade agreements in order to increase, as I say, the possibilities to enter into different markets. And a second example I can give you is Brazil. It is, of course, I can accept that Brazil during those years implemented different foreign policies. During a certain time was accepting some United States approaches to the problems in the region. Many people say that Brazil was doing so because it wanted to be recognized as the leader of the region. And of course, it is quite understandable that there is no possibility to establish a regional order if this regional order has not the acceptance by the international order. So Brazil, during certain periods of those years, were accepting this United States centered approach, yes, but also keeping its independence. For example, when during the last year of the presidency of President Lula da Silva, Brazil made very clear that he wanted to implement, or he wanted to become a global player. If you take a look at the at the opening of many Brazilian embassies all over the world, including the opening of Brazilian embassy here in Astana in 2008, the opening of many embassies in Sub-Saharan Africa, the opening of many embassies in Asian countries. Okay, you can see that Brazil wanted to become a global player, so it was trying to implement this multi-vectoral foreign policy, wanted to be a global player, and for example, maybe many of you can remember when Brazil tried to generate an agreement with the G5+1 countries and Iran with the support of Turkey in May 2010. So those are examples of Brazil pretty active and pretty global Brazilian foreign policy. And of course, you should bear in mind that the establishment of the forum, as called as BRICS, or first of all was IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, then Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa were part of those moments when Brazil was saying, okay, I want to be recognized as a regional player, but at the same time, I want to be a global player. And if I have to take some decisions that are maybe not so close to American interests, there is no problem. I will do it because I'm a responsible global player. So those are the three most important groups of countries regarding foreign policies that were implemented in the last, let's say, 20 years. Yes, countries that still maintain a preferential relation with the United States, countries that generated what we can call an anti-imperialist foreign policy, and countries that developed this kind of multi-vectoral foreign policy. But please, again, I want to emphasize this. Each country was changing its foreign policy. It doesn't mean that a country generated a specific foreign policy for those 25 years. Not, for example, I can say that Argentina was quite American, quite focused on the United States in the 90s, was much more closer to what we can call anti-imperialist or ALBA countries during the first decade of the 21st century. And maybe today we are trying to develop a much more, let's say, multi-vectorial foreign policy. So those were the difference of the foreign policies in the region during the last quarter of century. If we leave this historical approach and we focus mainly on what is the agenda of the region, of course, we can establish two main group of issues. The first one is regarding economics, and the second one is regarding politics. In each of those issues, we can establish domestic and external priorities. Regarding economy, the domestic priorities, of course, that what we call the elimination of poverty and inequality, or social inclusion, is the priority of many Latin American governments. If I maybe I can say all the Latin American governments, because our region is becoming more and more unequal, and poverty is still there. So the domestic priority should be how to revert this trend. Based on that, or as a consequence of that, the main objective of many Latin American countries is how to secure the development of our society. When I'm saying development, I have to stress the idea that it is not only growth, because our region, if you take a look at the statistic, was growing a lot during the last 15 years. But this growth in terms of the GDP, it doesn't mean that our countries were developing. I said we were only growing. It is kind of paradox. It is quite sad to say it, but it is true. Our countries were growing a lot, maybe at 4, 5, even 10% of the GDP yearly, but at the same time, the development of our society was not growing at all. If we take a look at the external economic agenda, and if we also consider what about our foreign trade, we can say that the many Latin American countries now have a foreign trade that are based on four uh, partners. The first partner is maybe a quarter or in certain countries 30%, but is regional partners. So we are focusing on how to trade with other Latin American countries. The main problem regarding trading with Latin American partners is that in many cases we produce the same products, so we're much more competitors that complementary economies. At a quarter, let's say it is of our partners are European partners. That's very important. So just to take a look at what was the reality in the 19th century, where let's say mostly or 100% of our trade was focused only on European countries. Nowadays, it's maybe only a quarter of our trade is focused only on European countries. And then we have another, let's say, quarter is maybe or 20%. It's about China and other Asian countries. And then there are many problems involved in these economic relations that maybe I won't go into to discuss a bit more. And then the other quarter, it's about United States or other regions of the world. If we pay attention to what's going on, every Latin American country now is facing a great dilemma. It is about how to avoid the primarization of our foreign trade, how to stop selling primary goods and to begin to develop our economies. Of course, it is not so easy. Of course, it is not it will not be an objective that can be attained in just a couple of years, but at least it's on the agenda. And we, on the public declaration and the policies implemented for many Latin American countries, the idea to avoid primarization of our foreign trade, it is there, which at least I think that is important to notice this, because again, if I take a look at what's going on in the 19th century, this issue was not on the agenda. Actually, during those times, our countries thought that this bright future that I was talking about was based on the export of primary goods. So something has changed during those 100 years. I think it is quite good that our country have accepted this new idea. And if we take a look at the political agenda, again, we have issues that are much more domestic and issues that are much more external. Regarding the domestic politics in Latin America, I think that the greatest challenge is how to build a strong state. And when I'm saying a strong state, I do not mean an autocratic state. What I mean is a less bureaucratic state that can work on behalf of the citizens. Yes, providing, for example, security, providing health, providing education, providing good infrastructure. Yes, and we have in Latin America huge public sectors, but those huge public sectors that in each of our countries sometimes is not quite efficient. So we need to reorganize many of our states in order to be less bureaucratic and to begin to work for the citizens. The second important issue is what we can call the crisis of the traditional political parties. The traditional political parties that were established in the first part of the 20th century